As you are probably aware by now, you'll be going to the polls on the 26th of October to vote on the next President of Ireland, but also you're going to be asked a question about blasphemy and whether or not we should be removing blasphemy from our constitution. We're joined on the line now by Michael Nugent, who's chairperson with Atheist Ireland. And good morning to you, Michael. Just from the outset, you might outline your view. You would be voting yes or no to removing blasphemy.
Well, we think it's important to remove the offence of blasphemy from the Constitution, firstly because it's essentially a medieval religious offence. It's not something that a state should be implementing in the 21st century. It was introduced to our Constitution in 1937, and Ireland is a very different country now than it was in 1937. And it affects both the Irish media, because although it hasn't officially been enforced on anybody yet, we know that several media outlets choose to self-censor themselves just so that they don't get involved in a case like this. And it also affects both Ireland's reputation internationally and people in other countries who are persecuted by blasphemy laws, particularly in Islamic states, who cite the Irish law as an example of why it's okay for them to have blasphemy laws, because we passed a law in our statute books just 10 years ago. We're the first country to pass a new blasphemy law in the 21st century, and so it's having an impact internationally, where people are saying, well, if a modern democratic country like Ireland can pass blasphemy laws, why can't we? And then in those countries people are persecuted and indeed executed.
OK, now blasphemy, the dictionary definition is the action or offence of speaking sacrilegiously about God or sacred things. And obviously, if you are a person who is religious, you will be terribly offended if someone is speaking sacrilegiously about your God. Should we not have some provision that protects against that offence being caused?
No, we shouldn't. We should certainly have provisions to protect people from harm. We should have provisions to, there are indeed already provisions in terms of preventing incitement to hatred. There's the Public Order Act, there's various laws that will protect individual people from being harmed. But we shouldn't protect ideas from criticism. And that's the distinction that blasphemy does. It protects ideas, and indeed it only protects religious ideas. It doesn't protect non-religious ideas. I'm quite offended by some of the things that some religions say, but it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be allowed to say it. No person should be beneath respect, but no idea should be above criticism.
But are we not living in a world where we need a little bit more inclusivity and respect for other people's religions, not in a country where we get rid of any sort of ramifications for offending a person's religion?
Well, there's a difficult balance there between freedom of religion and belief and freedom of expression. It's something that has been always, some tension there. But there's a group called the Venice Commission, which is a legal constitutional group that advises the Council of Europe governments on constitutional issues. And it produced a comprehensive report on that balance. And what it concluded is that the purpose of any restriction on freedom of expression should be to protect individuals rather than beliefs, and it said that people should be allowed and must be allowed to criticise ideas, either religious or non-religious, even harshly and unreasonably, and even if it hurts other people's feelings, as long as they don't advocate hatred or violence. And it said that the level of people who are offended by that, their level of toleration should be raised, and that mutual understanding and respect can only be achieved through open debate and persuasion, not by banning speech. And that's the most democratic way of preserving the values that you've just outlined, which I agree with.
And some people would say, what harm has it done in the sense that no one has been convicted in what, was it 1800s or 1900? Someone was convicted of blasphemy. Certainly no one has been since Dermot Ahern brought in the provision. And even the Stephen Fry episode, yes, Gardaí investigated but found really nothing to investigate. What harm is that word doing in the Constitution, and why should we spend 3 or 4 million to get rid of that one word?
Well, in terms of the cost, we're having a presidential election anyway, so it's as cheap a way as you're going to get rid of something anachronistic.
But there is still a cost.
Something else.
There is still a cost, because we've to set up the referendum commission, keep it going, pay all the advertising to make people aware of the referendum. There is still a cost with having this.
There is, but it's a minimum cost in that it's not a standalone referendum, and every body that we've asked several bodies over the decades to examine the Irish Constitution, and without exception they've all recommended removing this and having a referendum to remove it. That goes back to 1991, the Law Reform Commission, 1996, the Constitution Review Group headed by T.K. Whittaker, the All-Party Committee on the Constitution in 2008, the Constitutional Convention, the UN Human Rights Committee, the Council of Europe. Every single body that has looked at this has said you have to get rid of it. Now, on the other point of what harm does it do, it does two things that are directly harmful as opposed to just symbolically. One is, one of the reasons that there are very few attempts to have cases on it is that the media chooses to self-censor itself. Now, I've been told, in fairness, not by your station, but I've been told on other stations before I do live interviews, make sure you don't say anything blasphemous. We have had articles that we're aware of, and the NUJ have also made this point. There have been articles in print publications that have been dropped or edited because of concerns of getting involved in blasphemy cases. So that's the first thing. It does have a silencing effect on the media, even if it isn't formally enforced. The second is, when we passed the new law in 2009, at the United Nations, the Islamic states started quoting from our law as what they wanted implemented around the world. And there are people like, for example, there are 24 victims of blasphemy laws around the world who have sent us a letter that was published in the Sunday Times over the weekend, asking the Irish people to help them by removing this, because it's used as cover by the Islamic states to say, here's a modern Western democratic state passing a blasphemy law in the 21st century. What's wrong with it? Led by Pakistan, where there's a Christian woman at the moment called Asia Bibi, currently awaiting execution for alleged blasphemy. And two politicians who spoke out in her favour were murdered for speaking out in her favour. So those are the type of regimes that are taking cover from the Irish blasphemy law. So it's important to remove it for that reason as well.
What sort of a reaction have you been getting from people? I know you launched at the weekend your campaign to remove the blasphemy provision. What have people been saying to you since the weekend?
Well, I think up to relatively recently, a lot of people just weren't even aware that the blasphemy law was in the Constitution. So we're starting from a low base of informing people that it's there, never mind that it's important to get rid of it. But once people find out that it's there is an overwhelming consensus that yes, in fact, it's silly seems to be the phrase that comes up most in ordinary conversation. You know, why have we got a law? Surely a God can take care of himself without having Eamon de Valera and the Irish Constitution assisting him. And there's also a recognition, not just among atheists, but among religious groups, Christian groups, the Ahmadi Muslims, who are a minority Muslim group, who are also persecuted for blasphemy in Islamic countries, evangelical Christians, even the Catholic Church has said that it is an anachronistic clause to have in the Constitution. So I think there's an overwhelming consensus once people are aware of it that it should be gone, and the challenge is to ensure that enough people are aware and they don't just wander into the ballot station to vote for the president and find another vote that they don't know anything about. OK, not everybody's in agreement. We did have Ronan Mullen on the show last week and he thinks it's just madness even that we're having this vote. And one of the things he said to us was that, speaking out against religious institutions is now the new norm in Ireland. And I think when I say religious institutions, I got the impression that he meant in particular that there's a sort of anti-Catholicism in Ireland now, and he's concerned about that actually people feel a little bit ashamed to say that they're Catholic in Ireland. And should that be the case? No, of course it shouldn't. Everybody should be entitled to believe whatever they want to believe and practice their either religious or non-religious beliefs freely. And but the blasphemy law doesn't, in fact, oppose that. The blasphemy law actually does oppose that freedom of religion and belief, because one religion's freedom of belief is another religion's blasphemy. That and indeed Ronan Mullen made that point himself. He actually opposed our blasphemy law when it was being passed in the Oireachtas, because he said that it didn't include an exception to allow religious groups to be blasphemous about other religious groups. So he in fact opposed that law because it didn't allow him to criticise other religions. So on that basis, it's a bit rich of him to then say that it's there to criticise Catholicism. Right. But obviously you welcome it because you welcome free speech. You don't mind him talking out about it either. No, and indeed, look, people have said all sorts of things about atheism, which do offend me, but I don't think that me being offended should mean that they should be outlawed from saying it. There are a lot of things in religious scripture that I consider to be very offensive and unjust in terms of treatment of women and treatment of gay people that are in sacred scriptures, that I consider to be very offensive to my fundamental values, but I don't think that the Bible or the Quran should be banned. I think people should be entitled to profess their beliefs, even if they're offensive to other people, as long as they're not encouraging hatred or crime or harm to other people.
OK, well, it's a debate that'll go on and on. We've heard both sides now. Michael, thank you very much. You've just launched your campaign to get rid of the blasphemy provision in the Constitution. That's Michael Nugent there, who is chairperson with Atheist Ireland.